Welcome everyone. First of all, I'd like to welcome our speakers, Nick Dyrenfurth and Godfrey Moase. It's of course the third and final event in our spring series, which is being called The Future of Worker Power. Now, many of you might be familiar with me as the kind of Fabians technology and Zoom specialist, but if you don't, my name is Santino Raftalis and I'm the Deputy Chair for the Australian Fabians Victorian Branch. Now, in the spirit of reconciliation, the Australian Fabians would like to acknowledge traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. All right. Well, as you're all familiar, if you've been to one of these events before, we'll be doing a Q&A towards the end. So of course, to facilitate that Q&A at the end, we encourage you to engage in discussions and use the Zoom chat to actually ask any questions you might have. You're more than welcome to ask those questions to the broader group. You're also more than welcome to send those through to me privately or any of the other hosts privately. There's always one person who forgets to mute themselves. All right. So we, of course, will be taking these questions. We'll be asking you to speak on those particular questions and articulate those to our speakers. We encourage you to be as brief as possible. It helps to facilitate hearing more of our speakers, which of course, that's what you're here for and that's what everyone else is here for. Sometimes we'll amalgamate some questions or themes from some of the commentary in the chat. So if you don't get an opportunity to directly ask your question, it may be absorbed into someone else's question indirectly. Okay, now to introduce this topic tonight, obviously we're all familiar with the fact that we've had this spring series, The Future of Worker Power, familiar tonight with the topic of industrial democracy. Now, as workers in Australia and indeed around the world grapple with an uncertain economic future in the aftermath of COVID-19, they not only face the first recession Australia has faced in approximately 30 years, but they also have to confront the twin challenges which have existed for some time now, for the best part of a decade, of persistent high employment and stagnant wages. Now, as legislators, unions and businesses argue over the solutions, what we should do to actually fix some of these problems, or indeed, if there are any problems to fix in the first place, this event asks the question of whether or not we should deepen and expand the power workers have in their workplaces to secure better wages, conditions and employment relationships. Now, to tackle tonight's policy, we're going to have two fantastic and phenomenal speakers who have distinguished themselves as eminent commentators and advocates in this particular space. First up, we have Nick, who is the Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre. He's been an immense contributor to the Australian Labour Party and more broadly the Australian union movement. Nick has written and spoken extensively on employee representation on boards as an innovative solution to democratise decision-making in workplace. And I'd like to invite him now to make a speech in his presentation to our group tonight.
Santino, thank you for that intro. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land who are meeting on virtually tonight, the Boonwurrung people, the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So can I begin by thanking the Victorian Fabians, especially you, Santino, for putting on tonight's event on this very important topic. I've been involved with the Fabians in one way or another for at least 15 years now. I was honoured to be involved in the Young Writers Prize way back in 2006 when I was a PhD student. And I can see my PhD supervisor there in the audience tonight, Marion. I haven't made her blush. And I was lucky enough to be included in the published anthology. So I've been a long-time admirer of the Fabians' work, creating a space for debating ideas and really just bringing people together to have an honest conversation. So on that note, I'd like to do some plain talking. I'll get to workplace democracy and specific co-determination at the moment. What I don't want to do, I could, but I don't want to labour the point on the woes of the ALP. But what I would like to get across to people tonight is in discussing industrial democracy, I really want to urge people to get back to basics. What is really required when we talk about changing Labor and getting Labor elected, particularly at a national level. We have to ask ourselves, what is the point of the Labor movement, politically and industrially? It's simple, it's the good life. We are about empowering people, and the stress is there on power to lead long, fulfilling lives rich in meaning. That is why Labor was put on this earth. It's not rocket science, but I think re-engaging with that core purpose has to underpin every piece of policy thinking and policy that we propose, including industrial democracy. I also think, I spoke about power before, but this really means hard thinking about how power works. The means of accruing power and to what ends we use it. Too often, I think, we confuse ends and means, and this leads to an absence of why. Why does Labor seek power? Well, Labor represents the Labor interests. That's Labor as in OUR, broadly conceived. Fundamentally, those who work for a living and who own very little capital. So the Labor interest winning and exercising power is the pathway to working people living a good life. From my perspective, I wear many hats: a unionist, Labor member, social democrat, but also a communitarian. From my view, this is the means to self-realisation, human flourishing, leading that good life. Without power, working people have less control over their own lives, individually and collectively, importantly in workplaces, but also their communities and the nation at large. So I'm going to hammer this point home. Labor's fundamental mission in life has to rest on a conception of a good life and a good society where people are empowered to lead long, meaningful, productive and healthy lives. I mentioned before, I view myself as a communitarian, and we know that the good life is not lived on some island. Human beings are social beings, who, for that very reason, have obligations to each other and duties to each other, and are not simply owed rights. This is where I think we need to take a very nuanced view of the state. Labor fundamentally exists to exercise power, to create and redistribute power and wealth to people. It's a really important point. Rather than just expanding the state to redistribute wealth without power, a really critical point. And this, what I've called this style of technocratic politics, I think is a dead end, and a dead end that we've been circling around for 2 or 3 decades now. As social democrats, as a social democratic party, this way of doing politics isn't very social, it's not very democratic, but it's paternalistic at its statist. It's about doing politics to and for people, but never actually with them. So, I mean, this brings us back again to Labor's being and the ideology, the ism of Labor, what I call Labourism. And Labourism is the strategy by which the Labor interest seeks to wield power, power not as an end in itself, but the means to subject the economy, the subject of tonight, to democratic forces. So that might be parliamentary action, but also through democratic self-governing institutions, unions critically. We're also talking about mutuals, co-operatives, faith groups, churches, mosques, synagogues. And these groups are in many ways better placed to constrain the power of the market, the free market, and the state. And I think this is really critical in 2020. I really think, as we negotiate COVID, there is a centre-left, Labourist, social democratic moment and an alternative, a post-liberal, communitarian politics of the common good. We have to start where people are. We have to start with people's grounding in family, workplaces, community, and the nation. We have to reject market fundamentalism, call it neoliberalism if you like. Yet we need to be really sceptical of centralised statism, the centralised state. Our task is to broker a popular common good, a new settlement in the national interest on behalf of the Labor interest. And this fundamental idea has been an animating idea of Labourism in its most successful electoral phases. The Curtin government, the picture of Jack or John Curtin there in the background, and his wartime government, the Hawke and Keating governments of the 80s and 90s, and back to the original Australian settlement of the 1900s, where Labor didn't govern much, but fundamentally set the ground rules and rewrote the rules of politics. So in 2020, turn towards the topic of workplace democracy more specifically. Federal Labor's focus really should be on strengthening institutions, not merely concerning itself with thinking and talking about tax and spending, but fixing structural faults in the economy, our workplace, social and physical infrastructure, national sovereignty. For me, I can't talk about this in depth tonight, but we need to thoroughly revise the enterprise bargaining system. We need to reinstate the value of vocational education, but we need to fix our workplaces. We can draw lessons from COVID. Some might quibble with this, Godfrey might quibble with this interpretation, but COVID in many ways has seen business and labour come together to save jobs and protect people's livelihoods. And Labor has a chance, building on this, to institutionalise these arrangements, to protect and prepare the economy and our workplaces for future crises, because there will be future pandemics, but most importantly, to empower working people to have more power over their lives. And that's where I and the John Curtin Research Centre very much think that Australia should be following the lead of Germany, much of Europe, thinking specifically about Scandinavia, but also Northern Europe, where large companies are required to have employees represented on their boards, what is known as co-determination. We need a workplace and a corporate culture fit for purpose in the 2020s and beyond. We need a more resilient pro-business, pro-worker framework, which prizes profit and profitability, but also values cooperation and fairness and equity. If we're going to build a higher growth, high skill, high wage economy and a clean energy economy, we need more balanced institutions. We need institutions focused on the long run, not sustained by ephemeral mining booms or lazy counterproductive measures such as cutting wages and making work even more secure than it is. And this is where I think Germany can be a new light on the hill, and co-determination can be the basis of what I call a transformative politics, radical but in some ways conservative, to reform our industrial and political life. And it's the major policy that we think Labor should adopt to reclaim its role as the party of working people, the party of growth, the party of productivity, and yes, the party of equality. Turning more specifically to co-determination, some of our audience might know a little bit about the concept, so apologise if I'm repeating concepts that you already know. Co-determination in Germany is a really tricky word, mitbestimmung, but it's one we should all get to know and pronounce as we look to reshape our workplaces. It has been the basis for the so-called German economic success story since World War II, particularly since the 1970s, and involves, quite determined and prescriptive cooperation between government, business and unions. The centrepiece, of course, of Germany's social market economy is the German Co-Determination Act of 1951, which legislated for co-determination along with work councils. This idea that committees can be formed to represent all employees at an enterprise levels, and these committees are informed and consulted on decisions concerning working rights and conditions. But the basic principle behind co-determination is really simple. For the good of everyone, working people have to have a fair say in the governance of their companies that they make productive and profitable. And we know the social market and co-determination is supported by all sides of German politics. The Conservative, the Christian Democrats have wobbled here and there and enjoys deep popular support. In fact, it was introduced as legislation by a Christian Democratic government. And the contrast with Australia is really stark. As I pointed out before, the last Liberal Prime Minister, not before the sort of rolling circus of Turnbull and Morrison, the last Liberal Prime Minister not to launch a Royal Commission into the unions was Billy McMahon, that terrific success story. There are, of course, important differences between Germany and Australia. Germany has a two-tier company board system made up of a supervisory board and a management board. Most countries, like Australia, with co-determination laws, have single-tier boards. I think specifically here of Sweden and France. Germany, co-determination is applied according to company size. So the One-Third Participation Act allocates 1/3 of supervisory board seats to employee representatives in companies with between 500 to 2,000 employees. In Germany, a company with over 2,000 employees means that workers have just under 1/2 of the seats. And you look at all the big German companies, Siemens, Bertelsmann, BMW, Daimler, they have board members elected by their workers. And this situation generally works effectively. Supervisory board, which is elected by a combination of shareholders and workers, is responsible for overseeing the company's strategy. The supervisory board's chair, who holds a casting vote, is always a shareholder rep. And that board is also responsible for appointing the management board, which oversees the company's day-to-day operations. Importantly, the management board is required to have one worker representative. Here's another tricky German word, Arbeitsdirektor. Technically neither board can interfere with each other's operations. But the genius of the system is, by virtue of employee representation, management cannot ignore the interests of the workforce, which happens so much in Australia and other Western capitalist democracies. The two boards generally work well together, and the shop floor level. Our proposal is to have co-determination, you've got to have work councils, and work councils are proven to be effective as well. They've been effective in terms of the company's treatment of individual employees, particularly around redeployment and dismissal. Work councils have co-decision rights to meet with management to discuss finances, work schedules, holidays and other matters. And here's where I think work councils co-determination could be really good in terms of making workplaces more family friendly, more gender friendly, and having a conversation about working from home and childcare. But they also have information and consultation rights as regarding the planning of new technologies, another really critical potential benefit of this model, and other issues such as mergers and retrenchments. And again, another critical point, they have access to information which is essential to bargaining negotiations. I spoke about enterprise bargaining before, but they have access to information about company profits and wages data. Just imagine the revolution in our workplaces if our workers and our unions had meaningful access to that data. So, big fan of co-determination, particularly in Germany. We think it's a win-win for labour and capital. We think it's a win for business. It's good for business because it draws upon the shop floor knowledge of the company's workforce. Management gets a better sense of what's actually going on the shop floor. The evidence suggests that co-determination of works councils associated with lower rates of absenteeism, more and better worker training training, and better occupational health and safety. And again, the critical point, this promotes consensus, long-term decision-making with better communication channels. For workers, they have a more strategic say. They receive a fairer distribution of profits, critically by the increased bargaining power of workers at the expense of owners or shareholders. The evidence is really clear. Just two studies that I'll cite for you. One study of 25 EU countries found that countries with stronger worker participation rights performed better in terms of productivity, R&D intensity, they had lower strike rates. Another examining inequality in OECD countries found that, shock horror, countries with co-determination had lower income inequality. So again, pro-worker, pro-business, and coming back to some of my original comments, this is a model which puts power directly in people's and workers' hands, because workers are given incentives and empowered to shape and share with owners the same long-term goals and policies. And in particular, that applies to technological change. Again, studies have shown there is less resistance to retraining and greater flexibility. Another great example to boost the German example is this. We know that over the 20th century, Germany transformed from a coal mining to a coal machine design, development, production and export country. Germany, depending on who you listen to, has just closed its last black coal mine and plans to phase out all coal. I think by 2040, it might be 2038. This is the direct result of co-determination, leading to superior environmental outcomes and technological innovation. Germany actually represents, in socialist parlance, an actually existing just clean energy transition. And Santino, if I get the chance to boost some of the Curtin Centre's work towards the end, some of the work they're doing in hydrogen is really exciting. And again, much of this bears on the co-determination structures. So we know it's worked for Germany. We know it's bucked the trend of developed world loss of well-paid blue-collar jobs to automation, but also to cheaper imports, notably from China. It emerged much more strongly from the shadows of the GFC. And it's still powering ahead in terms of heavy manufacturing, car manufacturing, and steel production. The other egalitarian aspect here, which we think has great application in Australia, is that co-determination can help tackle the problem of excessive CEO pay. The two-strike rule, shareholder pressure, public shaming simply hasn't worked in terms of shaming companies to pay salaries which actually align with performance. So the question many of you might be asking, can termination work in Australia? I think it's the wrong question to ask. I would put it to you is how will our future economy, how will our future workplaces function without this really meaningful voice for working people? And we've got a great example in place with our industry super funds, who we know smash and outperform bank or retail funds year after year after year. And of course, what's the beauty of their governance structure of these profit for members only? They have half employer, half worker representation, and the model works. We think it should be extended to government-owned entities to lead by example. Australia Post, most dramatically. Australia Post and its corporate governance culture is one sick puppy. I mean, that is putting it mildly. We think, a few posties and workers on the board of Australia Post would put an end to, the doling out of Cartier watches and the excessive remuneration that we have seen. And there is no reason why essential services such as water, gas, and electricity could not be subject to co-determination, given that state governments and Labor generally governs at a state level, appoint directors to the boards of these statutory authorities and government-owned businesses. I've also proposed, practical dimension, co-determination for our banking system. The banks really got away scot-free from the Royal Commission. And also, most recently, I think co-determination, having not only the co-determination in private aged care sector, which, absolute scandal in terms of the COVID infections and COVID deaths, particularly here in Victoria. Co-determination could really shake up that sector as well. I'd like to see a model where we had a third of the board directors representing shareholders, a third of the board representing actual workers, often precarious, migrant, female workers, and a third representing the families of residents in these private aged care sectors. Finally, I think there are big benefits for the labour movement. I said before, I think it really needs to be introduced with a concomitant establishment of enterprise level work councils. And here too, the opportunities arising out of co-determination on work councils could be hugely beneficial to labour. Worker representation is a perfect means of training up future generations, especially young people, to have the best and brightest workers schooled on the shop floor, and at work in Australia's boardrooms. But I think co-determination is bigger than labour. We have a chance to represent this policy as a bottom-up, nation-building institutional reform. This reform could help us grapple with the opportunities and the challenges, of course, of COVID, and the post-COVID world, and make sure the economy and the workplace works for working people. I really think as we continue to deal with a once in a century pandemic, although you wouldn't know it stepping out to the street now. I mentioned the Santino before. Certainly the residents of inner Melbourne and Balaclava are out on the beers. But as we deal with this pandemic, plot our recovery, there is a huge once in a generation nation building opportunity in front of us, one which the Commonwealth budget recently handed down simply wasn't up to. And I think it begins in our workplaces. It begins with our corporate culture. Bigger, smarter workplace democracy has to be front and centre of the Labor movement's agenda, the Labor Party's agenda, and Australia's agenda. Thank you.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for your presentation. I know that both myself and many of the other members of the Fabians have eagerly read many of your opinion pieces and many of the research articles that have come out of the John Curtin Research Centre. So we really appreciate you going into some more detail and talking to some of these really, really salient themes and points I think that are quite relevant for today. Now, I am going to hand over to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Godfrey, who is an executive director of the newly formed United Workers Union. He's a prolific writer and campaigner for workers within and external to the Australian union movement. Godfrey has written a little bit on cooperatives and workplace democracy as a solution to stagnant wages, which is something that many of our members have discussed over the last couple of months as being an issue they'd like to see the Fabians explore a little bit more. So we'd love to hear from you, Godfrey, and I believe you've also got a bit of a presentation for our members.
Great, thanks for having me, Santino, and thank you everyone. It's the first night after a long lockdown, and the fact that we have nearly 80 people here, I think, holds testament to how strongly everyone in this Zoom meeting tonight believes in industrial democracy. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm attending this meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I'll just bring up my, there we go. So what I want to talk a bit about tonight is not only why is industrial democracy important, what does it potentially look like, boiled down to its simplest essence, not as a total view over everything. We've only got a few minutes, but just at its basic DNA level, and then going to, most importantly, how do we win industrial democracy? Because they're incredibly tough. It's an incredibly tough fight to have, and we should be very real about the level of struggle that is involved in that. So the issue in terms of looking at the workplace as it is today, I come at this point of view as a democratic socialist. I believe essentially that labour should be sovereign over capital rather than capital being sovereign over labour when it comes to structuring our enterprises. But essentially, this is a simplification, but if I had to boil it down, private enterprise, our economy is run on a $1, one vote basis. The more capital you bring to an enterprise, the more of a say that you're going to have. That causes an issue. Now, I'm going to be quoting Race Matthews quite a bit tonight, and he is in attendance. So there is in no way, shape or form where I'm going to pretend that I am a great expert in this field relative to even many of you who are at this meeting. But the $1, one vote employee-employer model does bring up, as Race has said before, the agency dilemma. The divergences of interests emerging inevitably between the principals and agents in an agency relationship give rise to costs which defeat or detract from the purpose for which the relationship was created. So what does that look like in the world as it is today? In a world where we really don't have, in Australia at least, any semblance of industrial democracy. Well, those agency costs come out in many ways. Number one for me personally, because I also believe that the good life is important and that helping people develop their full potential and capacity as human beings is essentially why we're in this, not telling people what to do. That number one, the biggest cost of the employer-employee relationship is limiting human development. The way that traditional workplaces operate, you have a manager, the manager is voted in on a $1, one vote basis, and it tells a bunch of people what to do. It limits the capacity, skills, and wisdom that everyday workers can bring to our workplaces. A big agency cost of that is curtailing rights at work. I would read casualisation, contracting out, offshoring, atomization as ways of trying to, as complex reactions that capital is given to try and make sure that it gets enough profit out of the employer-employee relationship. And those impacts, as we've seen coming out of COVID-19, they have real costs for us in the community. And another key cost is all the surveillance and monitoring that goes into the workplace today. That often gets forgotten as a cost. The cost of security guards, security cameras, chain link fences, alarm systems, theft monitoring, electronic surveillance of workers. There is a whole system in place designed to ensure, from an employer perspective, employees are doing what they want them to do. And that is a cost. And it is a cost that ultimately we all bear in terms of the efficiencies of production. And I would read even global warming and COVID-19 itself and the production systems that are involved in the employer-employee relationship as evidence of the mounting agency cost with the way that we structure the employment relationship today. And it's a really interesting book from the 1980s. Joseph Tainter is no radical. He's an American small L liberal in terms of his politics, and wrote a historical and anthropological study of the collapse of a few different complex societies like the Mayan people, the Romans, and a couple of others. Essentially, I would highly recommend reading for any Fabians in attendance tonight. His end point of his book was that the ultimate cause of societal collapse is an economic one, being the diminishing returns on investments in social complexity. And particularly since the economic changes since the early 1980s globally, I would read them as diminishing returns coming out of investments in social complexity. And we can try and keep the basic DNA of how we structure our economy and forestall collapse, or most likely that I think will happen is just a long period of stagnation and all the attendant social problems that come with that. But the only way out of that is that assumption, I believe, is based on the prevailing economic relationships within such society. And you have to go to the base. You have to go to the fundamental DNA with which we structure our economic relationships. Now, Race wrote this in 1983, but I think it really captures the point in time in which we are today, where we have an economic system in crisis. All around the developed world, there is rising anger and frustration over the apparent inability of capitalism to cope with economic problems. And to be fair to Race, given the context of the early 1980s, there's a very apparent point about the problems of communism at the time to react to economic problems and the way that the Soviet Union was structured. So what do we do? It should be no secret or surprise for anyone attending this meeting tonight that I believe the workplace as it should be is run on one person, one vote. One human being, one vote. Labour with a U being sovereign over capital in the way that relationships, in the way that investment decisions happen in the workplace. And so I'm not really doing anything other than going back to the Victorian Fabian Society pamphlet number 39 in 1983, Race's Building the Society of Equals, Worker Cooperatives and the ALP. And reaffirming that contention that cooperatives constitute a new alternative to the bankrupt dogmas of private and public sector enterprise, an alternative incomparably superior to its two competitors and with the capacity to run both of them into the ground. Now, I don't think Race was having a dig at the idea of having key public institutions in public hands. I think a lot of that is the context of capitalism in crisis in Australia in the early 1980s and the Soviet Union, frankly, doing a lot worse. So that's the pamphlet. I would highly recommend to any Fabian tonight digging it out. If I'm going to be if I'm going to be plumbing anything, it's a booklet that had a 1983 recommended retail price of $1.50, because I think it is still highly relevant today and highly relevant for the moment that we're in, because ultimately we didn't take the choice of building the society of equals, either as Australia as a nation or even internally within the labour movement. And that was a choice that we could have made at the time. We didn't make it. We instituted a bunch of reforms that forestalled stagnation, but in return for mounting social complexity that is diminishing the returns that we can get out of the employer and employee relationship. So what do we know about worker cooperatives as they're structured today? There's a really interesting report that Virginie Puriton did in 2016, which was a meta-study of a whole bunch of business studies about the performance of worker cooperatives. And I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but essentially cooperatives are larger than conventional firms. They are applicable to a diverse range of industries, from care, services to heavy industrial work. They last longer and have a higher survival rate than conventional firms. They're more productive than conventional businesses. Importantly, for our very present moment, they're more resilient to crisis, and they drive equality because you vote your managers in. Sure, you might need a specialist leader, you might need a really good CEO, but it is the workers who are doing the hiring for that skill set and setting the market rate for what that skill set would be. There's always a really interesting element about, well, what is the relationship between cooperatives and unions? And I think it's important to put that on the table, particularly in the context of us talking as Fabians. And the way that I see the relationship between cooperatives and unions is that they are the institutional bricks and mortar for people to build a world beyond capitalism. And I mean that very seriously. I think that the separation of powers is a doctrine which applies to economic democracy as much as it applies to political democracy. And the failure of socialists in the past was thinking the separation of powers was some bourgeois concept. I would say it's a really important concept, and such an important concept that it needs to be taken out of its current box and spread to more parts of our society. And that economic democracy, for it to be functional and effective, requires a separation of powers. And so what does that look like in real life terms? Where the United Steelworkers, they have a union cooperative model, even Mondragon with its social councils, coming out of a period of time in fascist Spain where effectively unions were illegal, mind you, still had to invent something that ended up looking like a union to make their cooperatives work well. And what that looks like is, sure, you might elect your manager once a year at your general meeting, but what happens with that manager that you elect in the meantime? What happens if you elect the Trump in the year? You need a block on that power. And so you also elect your workplace reps, your delegates who bargain for you, who represent you, who also make sure that 99 people don't vote one person out just because they have a problem with that one person that's not grounded on anything ethical or objective. I think the other important thing for unions in terms of cooperatives is that we are a vehicle for popular and radical education. And one of the big gaps that can happen with cooperatives is that workers in very real sense are still alienated from their labour. If you still don't understand how the workplace works, how the finances flow within your workplace, then you have a barrier in order for you to be able to realise your full potential and have a real say and a meaningful say over how that workplace operates. And unions are very effective at popular education and being able to educate workers en masse and workplace reps en masse in order to understand how their businesses are run will be a critical thing, because unless we have that gap filled, what will happen is potentially in cooperatives is you'll have a rule of a managerial class over workers still, albeit probably on a more ethical basis than the current society, but that's still going to be a real issue that needs to be dealt with. And I think as well, in that metaphor, bricks and mortar, for me, cooperatives are the bricks and unions are the mortar. And having worker cooperators in unions still brings a class perspective to that. So it's not just my individual enterprise, it is what do we need to do as workers? What do we need to do as manufacturing workers, as carers, as office workers, as engineers, as whatever else? It is the mortar that connects the bricks to form a social whole. So final 4 minutes, how do we win industrial democracy? That is probably the big question, and one I'm quite keen to further talk about in the Q&A. Because, I mean, I'm a big fan of co-determination. I think it definitely has its place. You're not going to make every single enterprise in a world of 100% industrial democracy a privately run enterprise, albeit run by workers or having some say from a community. There are still public utilities and a public good. And I think there's a really important role for co-determination, as a transitional thing, but as a way to make public services still democratic and benefiting from that membership. However, remember what happened when we tried to introduce a mining tax in 2010, which was just like a few percentage points in terms of corporate tax rate cut for a few corporations and a super profits tax for a smaller number of corporations? There was an almighty wave of resistance. And we ain't going to get anything in terms of scale in industrial democracy without being able to plan for and overcome that almighty wave of resistance that's going to come from capital. Because if there's one thing that capital likes more than profit, it is control. And industrial democracy goes to the heart of control. Co-determination, it was born in a circumstance where you had two things: a massive, bloody big strike wave in Germany post-World War II in coal and steel industries, where workers were saying, we want this and you got to deal with it. And in the context of where it was fledgling in the early 1920s, basically a revolution post-World War I. And the second thing that came about with two of them is you had a class that was running society that massively discredited itself with World War I and with the Nazis. And that was a very real issue in post-World War II Germany. On the Western side was a lot of issues dealing with continuity of key operatives between those places. So arguably today, with the climate crisis and other crises in capitalism, there is some degree in which traditional operatives of capital have undermined their authority, but we are a very long way from building up that ability to get people to act collectively. One good thing though, in terms of cooperatives, is that the higher the number of existing worker cooperatives globally, if you take places like the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, Basque region of Spain, some parts of France, is that the higher the number of existing worker cooperatives, the higher the rate at which new cooperatives are created. And so what I'm positing to you tonight is that think of it as like the basic DNA of constructing a new society, a replicating bit of information, a byte of information. If you can get that, that essential building block established, if you can propagate it, then once you get it going, you can grow it bigger and faster through the rest of society. And the labour movement is going to be absolutely vital to building the cooperative sector. So the way that we do that is adopting an organising for ownership strategy. People working on individual cooperatives are very useful. As a prefigurative example, they can highlight a deep impact in the lives of a relatively small number of people. And given it's the basic building block, capable of being replicated later. It can have impact, it doesn't have scale, so you've got to work out how to deal with the scale. Social democratic reformist governments can be very, very important and highly strategic in this. Within the terms of the existing power arrangement of the Australian economy, I still believe that there is space for progressive governments and for Labor governments to incubate some forms of economic democracy through a conscious cooperatives and mutual strategy. It can be done at local, state and national levels. For us in the union movement, adopting an organising for ownership investment and procurement model internally is important, and externally taking up Alison Pennington's call to go after managerial prerogative in the workplace is important, because we're going to need a struggle to win it. But first you've got to get the people, not the cooperatives. And I think that you've got it, for that to happen, you need education and study circles and whatnot. I think the Fabians can play a really important role in educational materials, in helping people study this sort of model, and it can have a very outsized impact on society. But ultimately, what it comes down to is join your union if you're not in one, and join cooperatives. Where there's a cooperative solution, join that cooperative solution. So I'm going to finish with a plug. If you can choose your electricity in Victoria or anywhere where there's privatised electricity, a bunch of unions around the country have set up cooperative power. Switch across to that. Or if you're with a private bank or a corporate bank, switch across to a credit union. Because while individual action is not the be all and end all, change has still got to start somewhere. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Godfrey. Unfortunately, as you're both probably well aware, unlike in person, you can't hear the applause of everyone in their own homes, but rest assured, I've had a bit of a scan around and I can see people are clapping and applauding. So I do want to say thank you very much for delivering that presentation, firstly, Godfrey, and secondly, for providing me with some reading material after my exams, both of which are very appreciated. But I want to take this moment and opportunity to thank you both for your presentations. I think that from what I can see already, people have been asking questions and engaging in discussion in the chat. Now, what I've done is I've extracted some of those questions already, and I'll put some of those questions just so they don't get lost through the entire kind of discourse of the evening. Some people will have made their question around 45 minutes ago or half an hour ago. I don't want that to necessarily get lost. What I'll also say is, for everyone who hasn't asked a question yet or who hasn't had the opportunity to articulate their thoughts, please use this opportunity right now to articulate some questions. Indeed, have a bit of a look at what some of the other questions are that people have put to our speakers, and feel free to bounce off some of those questions. Feel free to kind of tack on to some of those ideas. So the first question that I did want to highlight, that was one of the first questions we received, was from Julia. Julia, do you want to ask your questions with respect to small businesses or the gig economy? I think it was directed to Nick, but I think likewise it could potentially be directed as well at Godfrey in some ways.
I don't actually sorry, I was so busy taking notes that I'd actually forgotten I'd asked the question, but it was to do with, I suppose particularly directed to Nick, was to do with the question of how, particularly people in the gig economy where the employer effectively refuses to admit that they are the employer, how you can start anything like that kind of level of organisation that you were talking about that occurs in Germany.
Thanks, Julia. It's a good question. I perhaps didn't emphasise enough how my view, certainly, of co-determination is. I talked about CEO pay, but we see it as a means of lifting workers' wages. We know that Australian wages are growing at record lows since records began in 1987. Another element of co-determination that we think is really highly applicable to the Australian economy is the issue that you raised there with the gig economy and in particular job insecurity. And these are issues which existed well before COVID and have been accentuated, amplified by the COVID crisis. We still have well over 2 million, perhaps 2.5 million Australians are either unemployed or underemployed or underutilised. That is a scandalous waste of a nation's resources and our human capital. So, ideally, we'd like to see the big gig economy operators, Uber, Deliveroo, and the like, have some form of co-determination in place, whether that's mandated or not. It's our belief that we have to, a bit like what Godfrey was saying in terms of cooperatives and scale. I think you need to start modestly and start conservatively and work out. I really do. I think that state-owned statutory corporations are crucial. There are many people in ALP, particularly from the tendency that I am from, who would hear my idea that we should stop appointing a clubby group of mates as directors on state-owned corporations and start actually having workers, whether involved in gas or water or other utilities, on the boards. But that is critical. And I think that they're all, if we get that building block in place, and crucially, if we can get the model in place in the private sector, and if we can convince people, if there's a practical dimension, just how to play it out in Germany and Sweden and Scandinavia and France and elsewhere, if people can be shown, like other big structural reforms, whether it's Medicare, whether it's compulsory superannuation, that, hey, co-determination's here, the sky hasn't fallen in, the sun has come up again in the morning, and the system works, it works for workers, it works for business. I think that's a really crucial step. And I'll just give you one practical example. We last week published a report on clean energy called Power State, Building a Victorian Hydrogen Industry. We've had lots of interest from clean energy companies. One of the really interesting facets, and something which heartens me and shows that, that there is scope here, particularly if you have new companies coming in whose corporate structure and culture and governance is different to the Australian way of doing things. One of the companies actually said to me, really keen on your idea, really keen on setting up shop in terms of hydrogen industry in Victoria. And guess what? They may have been buttering me out, but our corporate governance model reserves a spot on our board for workers, for employees of the company. This is not a small company. This is a company which operates throughout the world. In terms of importing the model, I think, German companies which have set up shop in Australia, again, I think they're a no-brainer in terms of, asking them, making it incumbent on them to translate their way of doing corporate governance to Australia. And think of Deutsche Bank, Siemens, and the list goes on. But also companies engaged in the clean energy space. I'm realistic. I'm not suggesting the co-determination, is a silver bullet or a magic bullet. It's not going to take away all the problems, structural problems of our economy. It's not going to create a social democratic utopia or a democratic socialist utopia as Godfrey envisions. But we think it is, it's a practical and a workable proposal which can, attack and address the big structural problems, wages growth, insecure work, and the fact that and why Australian workers suffering low wages growth, insecure work, they fundamentally do not have power in their workplaces, and this is a small means which could become a bigger means of putting power directly in the hands of working class Australians.
Brilliant. Perhaps the same question could almost be remastered for yourself, Godfrey, because you spoke quite extensively on cooperatives, but is there sort of some challenges, or I imagine there are a number of challenges to kind of building a cooperative model in an environment which is more hospitable for gig workers and gig companies and the like?
Yeah, the cooperative model, I should say, like anything that is a model can be used for many different purposes, and really ultimately what underlines it is how are people working together. It is us as people, as citizens, as workers, as community members, doing things together and cooperating together that is really what breathes life into anything. And so cooperatives can be very useful in dealing with the gig economy, because what the gig economy is essentially is the monetizing of platforms. It is really at heart capturing new forms of rent. So it's not really even traditionally capitalist in the sense. It is a digital version of the Hungry Mile on the docks. And so cooperatives are very useful as platform cooperatives in the sense that you can go, well, we've got that infrastructure, and rather than collecting rents off that infrastructure, we're going to digitally and democratically manage that piece of infrastructure. And that you've got many models of that around the world. Perhaps the most interesting one is a group called Smart in Belgium, which is a collective of freelancers in the creative industries that has 30,000 members. It's a digital platform that does a whole bunch of stuff like making sure that the workers who are employees of that platform get their invoices paid on time and collectivized, following up publishers, festivals, producers and whatnot to actually pay people on time, provides office spaces for collectives and whatnot. You could very easily have that as with a union model as well, and have a whole bunch of, if you imported that into Australia, a whole bunch of unions who are cooperating based on the coverage of the workers who are signed up to that as freelancers. So the cooperative model, one of its strengths is that because it's essentially one person, one vote, one worker, one vote, you can adopt it for the gig economy, because at heart, it's not about are you deemed an employee at law, it's do you work and do you need to survive off the proceeds of that work?
Brilliant. All right. Well, I might move to the next question. This one comes from Frank Stilwell. If you would like to ask it yourself, wherever you are, Frank.
Sure, I'd happily do that. Thanks, Santina. I enjoyed both of the presentations, and certainly we do need an alternative to the dire situation of employer-employee relations that now exists in Australian society. The grotesque self-rewarding of a managerial class is just one indication of a fundamentally corrupted system of production, and cooperation of some sort is necessary in a transition to a more democratic socialist society. But having made that preamble, Nick, it seems to me your reform has one thing going for it, that a Labour government, if such a thing should ever exist again, could legislatively require it of businesses. But then I think there's a danger that it could mean that workers become more divided according to the firms in which they're employed. In other words, they're encouraged to develop an identity and commitment to their business. And that could be seen as fracturing class solidarity. So the question I put to both of you is, well, what if the co-determination model was seen as just a stepping stone to the more fully fledged cooperative model that you're advocating, Godfrey? You mentioned this as one possibility in your presentation of a transitional arrangement. Co-determination leading on to a more pervasive embrace of a worker cooperative model. Now, put in that way, as a two-step process, do you think that could be both feasible and more exciting of the passions?
Godfrey, did you want to go first?
I'm happy for you to, Nick. No dramas.
Sure. Frank, thank you for the question. I think this is going back to the 70s moment. A lot of, I'm sure you know, and Godfrey know, that there was a big industrial democratic moment in the 1970s where we looked to Germany and Scandinavia and elsewhere, and delegation visited Europe. And in fact, the ACTU and other unions. In fact, the union that I'm a member of, the Australian Workers Union, who now have come out in full public support of co-determination. But in the 1970s, they were supportive of those developments in worker democracy. But this is an old problem that you raised, that you can potentially divide workers, that one worker on a board of, say, a dozen high-powered corporate individuals may be outgunned, maybe sucked into the bubble culture of the particular company. And this is a problem we're aware of. So whilst we think we should start modestly and gradually, and in a gradualist Fabian style, if you will, if this is going to work, we're going to need to push up to at least we need to at least push up to a third of directorships on boards being employee representations. Otherwise, they're just going to be outgunned. And this is why I'm stressing the crucial role for statutory tort corporations. State Labor governments have a big role to play here. This is where I think we have a huge opportunity to stress just how successful our industry super funds have been with the 50-50 common ground approach between employees and employers on boards, that it works. The sky hasn't fallen in. But you're right, we need a Labor government in office, and tragically, we have been in power. The last 24 years, we've been in power for 6 of the last 24 years. This is about a period nationally for the ALP as the bad dark days, the 1950s and 60s. But of course, out of that period emerged a lot of creative thinking, which found expression in the Whitlam government, found expression in terrific reformist Labor governments in South Australia and Victoria, the resurgence of Queensland Labor. And it is, I don't wish to harp on last year's election, but it really is a tragedy, because it's specifically in terms of co-determination, we had the ACTU on board. It's part of its manifesto, part of its policy platform. Co-determination in a slightly watered down aspirational language, which I would have liked to have seen strengthened, but I can understand the electoral sensitivities. Co-determination was there in ALP national platform, and it is still there. Co-determination was supported by Bill Shorten. Bill Shorten has written about his support of co-determination and work councils, and is supported by other leading figures in our movement. Jim Chalmers, who's our shadow treasurer, who's often touted as a future Labor leader federally. Jim is a big fan of co-determination and a big fan of adapting that model to make sure that Industry 4.0, the technological revolution, which is developing our economy and workplaces, actually works for working people, but it can actually be good for business. And I think this is probably the other part of the equation that we really need to stress is this is not just about worker power. It is about worker power. It is about addressing the fundamental imbalance in power between capital and labour, which began in the late 1970s and has spiralled out of control. The GFC exposed the imbalance between capital and labour, particularly predatory, globalised capital, but we really haven't been able to build a mass movement to do anything about it. But I think we really need to make the case to capital, to good corporate citizens. This is a way of actually making your businesses work better, to make them work more efficiently, productively. You'll have happier, more productive, better paid workers, and it is a win-win for labour and capital.
Just to answer your question, Frank, despite my reputation, I'm no purist when it comes to actual outcome in terms of how things play out. And I do think that there is a really interesting way in which you might have an interaction and a bouncing off of people being inspired and learning from various co-determination models and cooperative models. What I would say is this, and quite controversially, is that yes, we know that we need deep structural reform into the way that our society and our economy works, and that's a matter of urgency. We do know that it would be better to have a Labor government than a LNP government. But I don't think we should consign ourselves to just waiting to see what happens when there is a change of government. We know that the Christian Democrats introduced co-determination in Germany initially. We know that Labor, as in the Labor movement, set a lot of the agenda in the earlier 20th century without being in government for a lot. If we have those struggles, if we back ourselves in, we can set the agenda and we can win reforms while we've got a really bad government, and we can then make those reforms even better when we have a Labor government. What I like about the cooperative model is that it takes advantage of the intersectional approach. We can, in the gaps in society, with a Labor movement that has hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, that has hundreds of thousands of members, that has deep relationships into society, we can find those opportunities and set up cooperatives if we get our ducks in a row. We can get a local government or a state government to introduce a co-determination model somewhere. The missing link in all of this is we have to do our role as Fabians to help people in an education process to believe that they can be just as good as their manager at running their workplace. And whether that means it's co-determination or cooperative at the first breakthrough, frankly, I don't care. But we need to help people get that through their heads and believe it with their hearts, because then a lot of things are going to be possible from there.
So Tina, can I just jump in there and just riffing off Godfrey's point? I absolutely agree with Godfrey. It's not all about electing Labor governments. I think it's really crucial. One of the just two quick points. One of the crucial elements, crucial aspects of Labor's success between the party's founding in 1891 and winning majority government in 1910 was we built institutions. We built a mass union movement which could exert industrial influence on the economy, on workplaces, and on Parliament, and through institutions like industrial arbitration, wages boards, and the like. What it meant was that even if we didn't get national Labor governments up at election time, and frankly, that is the story of the 20th century, the institutions survived, and it meant that the labour interest was protected. And this is one of the crucial aspects about Germany. The institutions were put in place in the 50s, strengthened in the 1970s by the Social Democrats. And even though the Social Democrats have waned, very sad, and some might argue dramatic and perhaps irreversible ways, the institutions, the workplace and economic institutions exist. And so you still have, in a very large extent, a social democratic political economy. Unfortunately, in Australia, we got rid of the old labourist social democratic institutions. I think the 1993 enterprise bargaining revisions were a major misstep. And that is, once we got rid of the superstructure institutions, that has had a whole range of devastating effects for trade unions, but also for the lives of working people.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that add-on, Nick, and some of the points that you touched on in terms of ALP history might be covered in a book that you wrote, A Little History of the Australian Labour Party, potentially, if people want to read a little bit more about that. But I'd like to ask Chano to ask his question to both presenters.
Oh, yeah. So I think, if I remember correctly, Godfrey mentioned that one of the advantages of cooperatives are that they're able to set the rate of CEO and manager remuneration. Doesn't this necessarily mean that privately held firms can, pardon me, essentially just outbid cooperatives when they're in the battle for hiring better managerial talent? And I guess the follow-up to that is, does the co-determination model sort of fix this problem?
Well, I would agree with you, Chano, that in the interim period of time, private capital is going to have a lot more money than cooperatives. What I would say is this. I would question the very logic that the best leader is someone who's just going to accept the greatest amount of money for any task. People make decisions about their working lives for a whole bunch of other reasons other than money. A lot of people in this chat, in this seminar tonight, would have made very many different career choices based on vocational beliefs, based on wanting to contribute to a common and public good. There are going to be some losses at the end of the day from some management types who are going to go from cooperatives to getting more money at particular points in time in their career. I just don't think that that's going to kill the model. And I don't think it's going to kill the model for two reasons. Number one, it hasn't killed the model in parts of Europe where there's getting critical mass at a provincial and town level in terms of numbers of cooperatives. Number two, as to why I don't think it's going to kill the model, is coming back to that idea that helping workers, at the role that unions can play within a broader cooperative ecosystem of helping people educate and understand how businesses work, will ensure that there's a greater number of people who could step up to those leadership roles over time, and will therefore probably dilute the market for that CEO level position in of itself, which is no bad thing. But I think the co-determination model still has something to add there. And as I've said before, I'm a why not both kind of guy. And I don't see why we couldn't just see where the biggest breakthrough comes through by helping educate workers about how they could run enterprises or be involved in that, and taking on struggles within the labour movement with a U around managerial prerogative.
Was there anything that that you wanted to add, Nick, or do you feel as if that that was covered fairly well from Godfrey, and there's probably nothing more that your model has to kind of address?
No, and I'm cognizant that I've been providing very long answers. I'd also just say to Godfrey, I feel like I wish I had that meme of the little girl, why not both, to pop up on the screen. I'm supportive of cooperatives. My realist view is I don't think we can grow them at scale in Australia, but I think, they've played a role. You know, if you look at major industries like sugar, if you look at what farmers and other primary producers have got up to over the 19th and 20th century, essentially operated as cooperatives and still do in many cases, certainly a role for our cooperatives. So certainly don't think that I'm putting all the eggs in the co-determination basket. Cooperatives have a place, mutuals have a place. I think Godfrey's right to especially to point to banking as community banking and as a system that we should get behind and join your union.
Absolutely. Well, look, in the aftermath of I think some council elections that still haven't yet finalised and been completed, and some of you who live in Victoria unfortunately didn't get to take part in some council elections. We have a question from Leon about potentially rolling out things like the cooperative model at a council level. Leon, did you want to speak to that particular question?
Yes, thank you. The ALP through Sonia recently reviewed the Local Government Act. Do you think there was an opportunity missed to be able to bring a cooperative model in local government where the councillors actually have some power instead of just being figureheads, to be able to also be retracted if they're performing badly from the community, even though, Godfrey, you said you can't have 99% people angry with one mistake. So do you reckon there's an opportunity with local government to be a real grassroots power?
Sure. I mean, why not? I think the way that we run local councils in Victoria in particular are just such an overhang of the neoliberal model. Like, it's the CEO that has the power, and it's quite corporatized in that regard. I'm not the greatest expert in terms of local government, so I don't know how much I could really add in terms of the intricacies of council governance internally, but I do think that there may be something in that, Leon, and I would also say that there is great space for local councils, although we have less power in Victoria in particular, to create, to go down the cooperative route in terms of their economic strategies coming out of COVID-19. And we really only need one. Getting to scale is a matter of how quickly something can replicate. And I think that cooperatives can follow an exponential growth curve. So to answer your question, Leon, I think there's some really interesting stuff about cooperatives and local councils in the UK in particular, and having a look at the Preston model, which I've put in the chat, might be some interesting follow-up.
Santino, can I jump in there just on the local angle? We actually think, I'm a big fan of devolving power to people, the principle of subsidiarity, which I know a lot of you would aware that I've been very keen on adapting some of the ideas of the Blue Labour movement in Britain, but specifically in terms of local government and local provision of essential services, we think there's a role for co-determination again. Take public schools. At the moment, you have parents are involved, in a minority basis in the management of state schools, but essentially run by the government. We think that public schools should be run by the third basis, where you have a governing board with a third teacher reps, the people actually, they're providing their labour on site, third parent reps, and a third, the essential owner or the provider or the funder of the service being government. And that should be rolled out in terms of, local governments. My kids have attended local government, well, they attended state school now, primary school level, but also for childcare. Local governments, certainly where I live, are involved in the provision of childcare. Again, I see no reason why we can't have a third model. So a third childcare educators, third parents of kids, and a third, the ultimate funder or provider of the service, in this case, local government.
Fantastic. Well, I suppose one of the themes that I've identified from a couple of questions and a couple of comments, and just something upon some observations. Godfrey, obviously you come from a union background, and Nick, you've obviously been quite heavily involved and also come from a union background in a lot of ways. When we're thinking and discussing things like a cooperative model or a co-determination model, we've talked a little bit about the overlap between unions and workers, but is there real space here that unions lose a lot of their both political capital, but also their kind of industry capital, the capacity for them to actually play a role in a workplace? Or do you see them being far more complementary? And if so, how would that actually look? How would that operate in practice?
I think it comes down to how you conceptualise a union. If the union is there to speak for the workers on their behalf, then co-determination cooperatives can potentially be quite threatening and problematic. It's like, well, there's a thing that unions can exercise agency that doesn't rely on the union, that workers can exercise agency that doesn't rely on the union office. However, if you conceive of union as a verb, workers being union and doing things, then co-determination, cooperatives, other forms of economic democracy are ways in which workers can be union. And, German unions do have quite a bit of time and effort that go into helping train reps on managerial boards. And that is a really important role that they play within their system. By no means the only role, but you had, IG Metall spends a lot of its time training reps and fighting for the 28-hour week and engaging in co-determination. So I think that it can be challenging more so for union leaders sometimes than it is for union workers, but ultimately there is a really important role for them to all work together.
Yeah, I concur on Godfrey on that point. It comes back to Frank's point. I mean, this is the old bugbear that, this was the opposition from unions in Australia, was that co-determination introduced a third party. So it put another structure in place between unions and employers, and thus diluting union power. But I'll be brief and I'll be succinct, certainly respect to co-determination. We have no other choice. If you look at the rates of union density in this country, and this is being replicated across the industrialised Western world, we have no other choice but to explore such creative options. Godfrey might correct me for the moment, but I think national union density is 15% currently. Yeah, and 7% in the private sector. If we are serious about strengthening labour power, addressing the imbalance between labour and capital, and doing something, and bearing the lives of working people through that fundamental understanding of power and power relations, then we have to think about new ways of expressing and having represented the labour power where it matters. And we're saying it matters at the boardroom level, but also in terms of the other examples I just used, it can matter at, the lowest levels, at local government and elsewhere.
Fantastic. Now, I think we may have our final question. I'd like to provide a little bit of context before I hand over to Paul to ask his question, which is obviously this entire kind of event series has been focusing on effectively, aside from furthering the power that workers have in their particular industries or workplaces, is about fixing things like stagnant wages, fixing things like inequality, fixing things like unemployment, so on and so forth. And we've alluded a lot to some historical examples of where cooperatives or co-determination have operated, and indeed we've also talked about some contemporary examples of where they operate, particularly in Europe and in Germany and Scandinavia and so on. So Paul, as someone who lives in Germany and someone who has some experience and knowledge, would you like to ask, I suppose, your question about perhaps the realities of the system?
Yeah, thanks, Santino. And first of all, because what I'm about to say the way I frame the question may sound a little critical, I want to thank Nick and Godfrey and yourself, Santino, for a fantastic presentation, well moderated and well presented. But I guess what I'm saying now particularly goes to Nick. Sorry, there was just a chat that someone can't hear me. No, you must be able to hear me. When I came to Germany 20 years ago, at first I read the publications from, for example, DGB, which is the main German equivalent of the ACTU, DBB, Marburger Bund, and a couple of other major union organizations. And I read it, I thought this is great. I had a look around. At first, I believed it too. I drank the Kool-Aid. But the reality is, I think it's a very dangerous thing to cite Germany as a great example of what co-determination can achieve, because it doesn't. I'll explain what I mean in a moment. And B, therefore, I would like to know what provisions or caution can be implemented to ensure that we don't have the same problem if we implement co-determination in Australia again. I think it's no coincidence that co-determination was actually introduced by a Conservative government here, because what it's allowed is, for this comment, well, you have your works councils and you have your representatives on the board, so shut up. The biggest, second largest wealth inequality in Europe is found in Germany. 60% of the assets in Germany are held by the upper 10% of earners. The lower 20% of earners in Germany have no assets whatsoever. We have a median net worth of 275,000, but a mean of only, an average of 275,000, but a median of only 60,000. And as I say, the lowest 20% have nothing. Why? Because, and I've seen this in family and friends, in personal experience, when you go to your works council, what you find is that, yes, there is a third player. It's not that the third player is between the unions and the company. It's that the third player is between the worker and the company. What we're seeing, what we have here is an elitist, entrenched interest of mostly in large capital organizations, people who are, excuse the naming of names, but Bill Shorten factional players of the union movement, sitting within their companies, and they are not interested in the needs of the individual who actually has a problem. The Works Council does not represent the workers. I see it time and again. That's the reality of what's happened in Germany. It's a nice theory, but it's not actually achieving. How can we, if we implement co-determination in Australia, perhaps as a stepping stone in the nice Marxist way on the road towards the ultimate goal of cooperatives? I don't know, but what can we do to ensure that we don't have the same thing? And please be wary of presenting Germany as a great model. It isn't.
Thanks, Paul. I think it's important, if I'm presenting Germany as a nirvana and co-determination as a nirvana, I don't mean to give off that impression. I think you're right to issue a caution, to caution us to think about how it's actually worked out in the field. The points I would make to you are, you mentioned, you talked about asset inequality. We know that inequality has increased in Germany in recent years and recent decades, but we know that income inequality has not risen as rapidly as in other comparative countries. That's just a fact. We know that through the practical experience of the GFC, we know that the German companies, Volkswagen, BMW, Siemens, that the co-determination actually acted as a brake on CEO pay and excessive management remuneration. That it actually worked and worked in a longer term, more sustainable, structuralised manner than what we had in Australia in terms of business and labour, making trade-offs in terms of, people cutting back hours but keeping their jobs, instead of being laid off. What we've seen in Australia is, we've had unions effectively have a de facto form of co-determination where they've worked with businesses, particularly heavy industry and manufacturers, and they've, when the companies got into strife, they've done deals, but because we don't have the permanent structure there, a few years later, when the company's got in trouble again or decided that it wants to offshore its industrial capacity and the like, that those deals are just traded away. And I think that the record shows that Germany, during the GFC, and Godfrey just raised the case of metal workers. Some people claim they've won the 4-hour working, 28-hour working week. Isn't quite true. This is more a defensive move, but it was a defensive move to protect jobs and to protect working people's wages in a time of acute crisis. I know there are other complaints made about the German system, that it restrains wages growth. I accept that. I mean, that's a fact. I think wages and wage inflation, in Germany has quite clearly been shown to have grown in more gradualist fashion. But there are arguments that's potentially a good thing. The final point I would make really is to pose the question back to you, Paul. If you were, a blue-collar worker working in heavy industry, working in manufacturing, would you rather have been working in Germany, or would you have rather been working in Australia over the last 2 to 3 decades? And I can tell you, if you surveyed the two nations' workforces as a whole, in particular those workers, they would say Germany every day of the week.
I think, Godfrey, did you want to add something?
Yeah, look, I think, Paul, what you've hit on there is, and to a lesser extent in terms of power, but still in terms of the way that it plays out, is a very real issue where you have a fissured workforce, an insecure workforce, where you have some people who are treated as insiders, as employees within most corporations these days. And in the Australian sense, that is a relatively small group of people in a lot of firms, particularly in blue-collar work or in service sector work. We have some employees who are the permanents, and then you have a floating group of casual labour on top of that, may or may not be employed by the same company, could happen in the same work site or be outsourced somewhere else. And if you just have co-determination in the abstract in Australia, one thing that I guarantee will definitely happen, if it's not a struggle that workers stand up for and win and is not part of a broader movement, is that it will reinforce that insider-outsider dynamic in our existing workplaces, because it exists in workplaces in Australia today. And it's expressed in a division between secure work and insecure work. And the secure workers don't really have a great deal in the scheme of things, but what ends up happening is they see they have some privilege. And it's not this simple per se, but what we have at the moment is secure workers tend to be around their workplaces longer, and it means that they trend towards being white and male. And insecure workers tend to be new entrants into the labour market. And so it's not always like this, but it tends to be recent migrants, women returning to the workforce, young workers coming into the workforce. And so co-determination, if it's part of a struggle, can be part of dealing with that. If it's instituted in the abstract, it is going to reinforce a lot of those divisions.
May I just have a quick comeback, particularly actually because Nick did pose a question to me. And Nick, as I'm not a blue collar worker, nor have I been in Australia for the last, permanently in Australia for the last 20 years, I can't answer that. What I can tell you is that the issue actually here where particular work councils are failing people, and I'm seeing it regularly, is white collar poverty. It's not the blue collar workers who need union support, who need co-determination and help these days desperately here right now in that they're suffering. It's the white collar people who are at the bottom of the tree and who are struggling and who have the lower incomes. And there I can tell you, in that role, I would much rather be working in Australia right now and over the last 20 years. I've seen it. It's interesting you mentioned Siemens, because that's one of the companies where I know someone personally very closely who is worse off now than he was 25 years ago when he started with the company in a white collar role. His works council have told him it doesn't fit with the union plans to support his issue. Thanks anyway. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, what we might say is, and I will make a very brief comment, which is, I'm glad that someone asked, I think it was Matthew asked in the chat, about the 80s and 90s and some of these challenges, because I think that, you know, cooperatives, co-determination, these are both models which have some significant pros and some significant benefits, and they also face, I think, some significant challenges and some significant divergences of opinions. But what I do want to say, I think, at this stage is, because I think we've gotten through most of the questions, is on behalf of the Fabians team, our membership and the broader community who I think will be able to see this online, I want to thank both of you, Godfrey and Nick. I think Nick has darted out of the room for just a moment. But I want to thank you both for your time and to speak to all of our members and, as I said, to the kind of broader progressive community. Because I think these are ideas that are worth discussing and worth debating. And I think, as I said, I can only see from my perspective, but I think I speak on behalf of many of our members when I say we have seen a real discussion and at times debate between two real intellectual giants of the progressive movement at this contemporary time in Australia. So I really appreciate it. I know we all really, really appreciate it. We hope that you'll continue to advance these discussions and discourse in all the commentary and publications and work that you do, because it is really vital for navigating the path to a more progressive, prosperous and egalitarian Australia. Now, at this juncture, I will hand over to Julia to talk a little bit about the online pub, but also to close out the meeting as the chair of the Victorian Fabians.